Hello, my name's Nick Dibble. I'm the consultant for School Social Work Services at the Department of Public Instruction. And this is the first in a series of webcasts that the Student Services Prevention and Wellness team is sponsoring on mental disorders in children and adolescents. With me is Roger Klein, a licensed psychologist. Roger, do you want to tell people a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. I've spent a lot of years working in the schools. I started teaching in Green Bay, Wisconsin, actually, back in 1971, and I taught psychology at the high school level. From there, I went on to graduate school. I became a school psychologist, and I was a school psychologist in Watertown, Wisconsin for about 29 years. The good news, Nick, is I got old enough to retire. Of course, the bad news is I was old enough to retire. Since I retired about 4 years ago, I've been in a full-time private practice working with an agency called Family Resources Associates. We're located in Watertown and in Lake Mills. So my background is primarily actually working in schools, and so I'm very familiar with that. And what I'm hoping to do today with Nick's help is to talk a little bit about mental health issues, things that you can be looking for in the classroom. And Nick is going to be chiming in with questions when I say something that might not be very clear, so we're going to try to keep things clear for you, and we'll kind of go from there. The unfortunate part is we wish that you could be here to ask questions, but we'll try to maybe anticipate what some of those questions might be. So we're going to start simply looking, if you take a look at this slide, the little girl saying, "Mom, why do my rubber bracelets say, 'Live strong, be fearless, have faith,' and yours say, 'Live in fear, be worried, trust no one'?" We certainly are in a different society right now in regard to, it's a fear-based society in many ways, and many of our children are being faced with lots of different stresses. This is a really interesting study that was done by Kenneth Bell, who is a Los Angeles district attorney, and he was citing this study actually. This is a retrospective study looking at influences on children. And you can see by looking at this slide, in the 1950s, the number one influence on children was home, followed by school, church, peers, TV, media. And if you look at the jump ahead 30 years, in the 1980s, what children were reporting, the number one influence on their lives were home, then school, peers, TV, media, in church. And forward 10 more years ahead in the 1990s, peers have jumped to the top. TV media has gone up to number 2, school, home, and then church. If this study had been continued, if we take a look at the influences on children today in the 2000s, I think, Nick, what you'd see is TV media being the number one influence. And there's some interesting research on that, actually. A very recent study showed that about the average number of hours a child is watching TV or media is 6 hours. So we're looking at TV, video games, internet, etc.
So that includes all those different internet kind of things, okay.
So that's a huge influence on children, and it makes our job just a little more difficult because we're competing with these types of influences. So why are we looking at mental health? And mental health is really directly related to our jobs in school. And if a child is suffering from mental health issues, it's going to interfere with their performance in school. And school failure is strongly, as you see on the slide, is strongly related to untreated mental illness. In other words, kids who have untreated mental health issues are not going to do well in school. And it's very important that we provide intervention, at least looking at the classroom teacher's role, identifying and being able to refer. I wanted to talk briefly about the sources of stress, because stress actually feeds mental illness, in the sense of If you have a child with a depressive disorder, stress will feed that depression. If you have a child who has a predisposition to anxiety disorder, stress will help kick them into an anxiety disorder. Some of the sources of stress that our children are facing are listed here. Family, and what I'm talking about in regard to family is our families have changed pretty dramatically because of the types of stress on our families today. But we do know that about half of all children will face divorce in their parents. That's a mistake. Half of all marriages end in divorce.
There you go.
It's a lot of different, a great number of children, but half of all marriages end in divorce. 60%, interestingly, of second marriages end in divorce. So it doesn't get better. Other stresses within the family are about 1 in every 4 children nationally comes from a family with a serious drug or alcohol disorder. So someone in the family, either a parent or a brother or sister, aunt or uncle, having a serious drug or alcohol disorder.
Okay.
In the state of Wisconsin, it's actually 1 in 3 families that come from a family with a serious disorder. We can expect about 25% of our girls, by the time they reach the age of 18, will have been sexually molested. It approaches that same percentage. I think it's about 20% with boys. That molestation is generally from a family member or someone known to the family. The media I've alluded to already, and media has a great deal of influence. I just have to toggle back here in our PowerPoint. We always have these technical issues here. Here we go. So media we've already kind of talked about in its influence on children, but what does the media really teach as far as in what society is kind of, I'll roll that into one, is grow up really fast, really soon. Start drinking, start buying things, and so the media's message is not a real positive message in general. Interestingly, historically, if we look at this again, back in the 70s is when media began to look at, it was specifically the Vietnam War, and the researchers found that more people tuned into news when there were actual live segments of war, of people being killed, etc. And the advertisers kind of jumped on this, and what we've now grown to in the media is lots of violence, lots of sex, and children are being exposed to these kinds of things not only through television programs but through movies, etc.
So there seems like they're really getting a mixed message then, because on the media's saying one thing, and on the other hand, society is saying, you know, don't have sex and don't drink. And
yeah, the underlying message of society,
Right.
that media is grow up really fast and start buying things. School actually creates a lot of stress on kids simply because with all these other things going on in their lives, they do have to perform in school, and there's lots of competition in many of our schools. Sometimes kids put that competition on themselves. It's not always based on what we're doing in the classroom. We're trying to do a lot of more cooperative learning and helping kids realize they don't always have to be competing, that you can learn by cooperating. But also, when we look at the No Child Left Behind law, has actually created lots of stress, not only for kids,
oh yeah,
but for teachers.
for teachers and schools. you
Schools,
bet.
principals, school boards. So there's enough stress to go around in regard to schools. And our society in general, I've talked a little bit about, but kids really are no longer playing as much as they used to. They go to practices. So many of our kids now will call up one another and say, hey, do you want to go to practice? I'll give you a ride to practice. And when they get to practice, there's an adult there. So it's not a healthy situation in the sense of children need to play. Many of our kindergarten teachers have reported to me through the years, just recently in these last 5 to 10 years, that it seems like many of the children coming in really don't know how to play.
And when you say play, I think what you're talking about is that unstructured time when adults aren't telling them what to do.
Correct.
And what children are doing more of now, and when you say going to practice, is when it's an adult organized activity and they're not necessarily working through the disagreements, themselves. The adults are handling that for them.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And it's really important for kids' healthy development to be able to have those kind of interactions where they're trying to work through things and where they're just doing free play. And free play for a 6-year-old and 7-year-old playing soccer is going to look a lot different than what it looks like when they have to go to practice.
Absolutely.
And a lot healthier for them. So anyways, these are some of the sources of stress, and obviously all of you could come up with more. We know kids coming into our schools are stressed. So I want to just give this simple definition. Stress is a non-specific response of the body to any demand that's made upon it. And any kind of change actually creates stress. There's positive stress too. I mean, think about last time you went on vacation, Nick, which hopefully wasn't too long ago.
No, not too long. Last month. Month.
Oh, that's good. That's one thing I miss now. Being in private practice, I need to really watch out and be sure I take enough vacation time. But change, any kind of change, creates stress. And if you don't deal with that stress, it can create this tension, and unresolved stress will lead to anxiety. Untreated anxiety can lead to depression. So this is why we're so concerned about stress, because it adds to these issues of mental health that we're talking about today. So just as a quick example, this is a study that was done in 2006, and it was showing us that in grades 9 through 12, there was a greater mood disturbance report than those kids in grades 6 through 8. And one of the reasons for this is stress seems to accumulate. And so our kids in elementary school and middle school obviously are stressed. But the further on you get into school, the more stress kids take on. Nearly 2/3 of high school students, and this is really concerning, reported being bothered much or somewhat by worrying too much about things and being stressed out or anxious in the previous 2 weeks. And finally, 1/2 similarly endorsed feeling nervous, tense. 4 in 10 were feeling unhappy, sad, or depressed, and 1 in 4 feeling hopeless about their future. That's a large number of kids. And it really points out why we need to intervene in these kids' lives and identify who are these kids that are having these difficulties, because they're not going to come up and tell us, I'm feeling pretty hopeless today, unless we ask the question. So the diagnostic categories that we're going to look at today are listed here on your slide: internalizing problems, externalizing problems. Internalizing are the mood disorders of depression, and within that depression, we're going to talk a little bit more about that, what that might look like. Anxiety disorders, we're going to talk about some specific anxiety disorders. I want to give you some examples of those. And externalizing problems, conduct, oppositional, and defiant disorders, and ADHD, which are kids that are probably more readily identified for many of you in the classroom. It's easier for you to see which kid has ADHD versus which kid might be having a depressive episode or feeling very anxious. And some of the other disorders that we'll touch on are eating disorders, trauma-related disorders. Schizophrenia, we won't talk a lot about that, but just to be aware of it, in developmental disorders. And developmental disorders would be, we'll talk a little bit about that, but more of the autism spectrum disorders. I wanted to show you this drawing, and this drawing is from David. David was a 16-year-old student that I worked with many, many, many years ago. And this is a drawing we found of David's in his locker after his completed suicide. And David actually had left a note as well. And The importance of what we're talking about today is that the reality is one referral that you might make as a teacher in the classroom might make the difference of identifying someone that you have a gut feeling about who might be depressed, who might be feeling anxious, or that kid that's obviously failing, seems to be failing many subjects and maybe failing your subject, whatever subject that you're teaching. Doesn't mean that we're going to be able to prevent all suicides, but it does mean that we're going to be able to intervene perhaps and be able to help. Here's an example of a writing that a teacher found in this 10th grade girl's notebook and was able to make a referral, and actually this is from quite a few years ago as well. I can tell you that this young girl, who no longer is young, but is doing extremely well, received help, received treatment. Let me read this to you. Once upon a time, there was a girl who lived on lies. She wanted to hurt. She wanted to die. She even attempted suicide. But the plastic people who said they cared didn't give a damn about what she dared. They didn't know, and she wouldn't share. She can't tell anyone what she fears. She can't let anyone get near. Her parents say every day, "Ignore it, dear. It will go away." But alas, it doesn't. It gets worse every day. And more, she hates feeling this way. Her face a cool mask, waiting for someone to ask. But no one does, because no one knows about the nice girl whose mouth stays closed. There is nothing for her to do until she at last sleeps forever, free of the past. Again, it's kind of typifies, I think, of some of the struggles that our youth are going through. And in that earlier statistic, if you recall, we talked about 1 in 4 kids who actually contemplate suicide. And it's a major concern, but the good news is there's lots of help out there. It's a matter of how do we identify these kids. And we're going to get to that near the end and talk a little bit about how do we identify and what are some things that you can be doing in the classroom. So specifically on suicide, again, we know that's the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States. I think the number 1 is accidents, number 2 is actually homicides, and the 3rd is death by suicide.
And I think here in Wisconsin, it's actually the suicide's the 2nd leading
Correct.
cause of death, and homicide is 3rd.
Yeah. And again, we talk about 24% in grade 9 to 12 have seriously considered, and 8% of kids 9 through 12 have made some type of an attempt. 17% have had a specific plan. So we know that 90% of kids who feel suicidal, or 90% of kids who actually complete suicide and are suffering from depression. So depression is a major problem. Now, depression generally is thought of as a physical illness in the sense of you can have a predisposition to depression. And what we talked about earlier, if you recall, stress can kind of kick you into a depression. So the more stress in your life, the more likely you are to develop a depression, especially if you have a physical predisposition to this disorder. Here are some of the signs that you can see on this slide. Someone with a persistent sad or irritable mood. Irritability sometimes can be mistaken for, boy, he's in a bad mood. Well, yeah, and that mood could be actually depression. Loss of interest in activities once enjoyed. So these are kids who used to be really active and involved with things, but now who are dropping out of different things. They tend to isolate themselves. Change in appetite or body weight is an important piece here. Any type of either beginning to overeat or just not being very hungry. Difficulty sleeping or oversleeping. Sleep actually is like one of the number 1 things we look at with depression when we try to identify someone who has depression. A sleep disorder oftentimes is involved. Psychomotor agitation, retardation, just simply meaning someone who's like wound up a lot and seems agitated, or just the opposite of like no energy. And speaking of energy, loss of energy, difficulty concentrating, feeling worthless, feeling guilty, oftentimes every recurring thoughts of death or suicide.
Okay. Does depression look different in children and adolescents versus adults? Because I think most of us, when we think about depression, we kind of have the adult picture of depression and the sad effect and things like that.
Right.
Does it look any different in kids?
They actually have, kids and adults have these same kind of symptoms, but kids can look a little bit differently. And I think our next slide, we can look at that. But pretty much, it's pretty similar. But some of the behaviors you might see in the classroom are these physical complaints, kids who are absent from school a lot. So you might not see it in the classroom because they're absent from school a lot. But if a kid's absent from school a lot, it really needs to be followed up on, because it may be a sign this is a child who has depression. Kids who talk about running away. So you may pick this up in the classroom of hearing a kid talk about running away. Emotional outbursts, and this is that irritability piece that we talked about, reporting themselves as being bored. Now, we know that lots of kids report that in the summer because they just really want to get back to school. But we're talking about a kid who consistently, talks about being bored and nothing to do and withdraws from friends and activities, etc. A kid who uses alcohol or substances oftentimes is depressed. We find this a lot in that kids try to self-medicate and actually treat their depression by using. So kids who are using is a sign that there may be depression, and that really needs to be checked out. Kids who are very sensitive and react with extreme sensitivity to failure or rejection, kids who have reckless behavior, oftentimes are depressed. And difficulty with relationships, giving away possessions obviously is a big sign with kids as well as adults. And making statements or joking about killing oneself. This is something in the classroom where I think teachers can really help out in regard to when they hear kids joking about it. And kids like to joke a lot, but whenever you hear that type of joke, it's something that needs to be followed up on. So I wanted to talk just briefly about treatment. And the reason this is important is that depression is one of the most treatable illnesses that there is. And the way we treat depression, I've listed a few of treatment methods here. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a proven way that we know that kids as well as adults get better. Cognitive behavioral therapy uses techniques to help work on the false beliefs one has of oneself in regard to, especially with depression, there's a lot of negative self-talk. And so a part of it is just helping kids and adults as well, if we're treating adults, to begin to identify those negative self-talk patterns, to catch irrational thoughts. And, an example of an irrational thought would be, I can't do math. And many kids believe that. We're having math problems, but the reality is they can do some math. And so you help identify, well, can you add? Can you subtract? You find the things they can do. And so you help them identify, a more rational thought is, I can't do algebra. And that's just a small example of how we really look at how can we help change thought patterns. Family therapy is important, looking at what are the dynamics within the family that might be adding stress, or helping the family understand what depression is, helping them understand their role and how they can help. Medication evaluation is generally recommended because some kids really do respond to a medication intervention. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Exercise, physical exercise, actually is a very very good way to treat depression by getting kids, and I'll put adults in here as well, to begin to exercise actually begins to help change the chemicals, and there's endomorphins that are involved. And we actually find that people begin to have more serotonin available to themselves, which helps treat depression. And of course, a supportive school environment, along with a supportive home environment. So these are kids that we really need to make exceptions for in many things. When you have a child, for example, who's missed 2 weeks of school, they're having a depressive episode. When they come back into school, we need to, obviously, we welcome them back, and we say, hey, don't worry about these last 2 weeks.
Okay.
Today's a new day.
So rather than hitting them with, you've got 2 weeks of homework to make up right away and things like
Right,
that. Okay.
right. And I think this is where the pupil personnel team can really be helpful to teachers, because teachers don't necessarily know, oh, this kid's been home with a depressive episode. For all they know, if they don't get some feedback, this child decided not to come to school for 2 weeks. Although if you don't, you're not able to find, sometimes our pupil personnel folks may not know that either. Someone needs to be talking to the child, obviously, what's been going on in regard to their absence. But whatever you can do in the classroom to make it an accepting environment, welcoming them, having them in a welcoming mode to come back and not having to worry about, oh my gosh, now I have to do 2 weeks of work. Our next slide here, let me advance it this way. This just is a picture of a PET scan, and what it does show, and I thought this was important for people to see, actually see it, the brain on the left, you can see the highlighted red areas, is actually a brain that is having access to more serotonin. And serotonin, Nick, has really been linked to a major factor, a loss of serotonin, a major factor in depression symptoms. And you can probably all remember this from high school biology class. We have these synaptic gaps between our nerves in our brains, and this little gap is where the electric impulses jump from one nerve ending to the other nerve ending. And in that synaptic gap are these chemicals. They're called neurotransmitters. And the neurotransmitters are what can get unbalanced that can create depressive symptoms. And so some kids do respond to medication that are called SSRIs, and that's a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And the way that works is that medication actually blocks some of the serotonin reuptake sites so that the serotonin doesn't get taken up by these nerve endings so quickly, and it stays in the synaptic gap because those selective serotonin reuptake sites are inhibited, and you have serotonin that kind of sticks in that synaptic gap, and what you find is that kids then begin to have less depressive symptoms. Now, there's black box warnings on SSRIs for children, other than Prozac is the only antidepressant that the FDA has approved to use with children and adolescents. However, off-label prescription by a really good psychiatrist has been shown to be very effective in using some of these other antidepressant medications. And it's simply an important part of following up with these kids when they're on medication.
Primary care physicians are prescribing more antidepressants these days too, aren't they?
Yeah, they are, and part of the reason is that there's just so few psychiatrists available, especially in our rural areas. It's really difficult to find a psychiatrist. And there are some primary docs who feel really confident because they've done a lot of extra studying and they're prescribing a lot, as well as some physician's assistants who are very competent and able to prescribe these medications. Okay, so I want to talk about anxiety for a little bit. The reason, these are the most common mental illness in the United States is anxiety, affecting, as you can see on the slide, 40 million adults age 18 and older. That's 18% of our population suffering from anxiety disorders. Now in children, it's not quite as severe. However, about 10%. So we have 10 out of 100 children who will meet criteria at any given time for an anxiety disorder. Our definition, as you can see on your slide, painful or apprehensive uneasiness of mind over an impending or anticipated ill. It's elicited by stress. It's manifested physically and behaviorally. In other words, children with anxiety have physical symptoms, stomach aches, headaches, shortness of breath, heart palpitations, and behavioral symptoms as well. The behavioral symptoms, can be being extremely withdrawing from something, avoiding something, etc. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the specific disorders. This anxiety can be general or situational. And general is what we call a trait chronic or neurotic anxiety. Again, it's kids who have a physical predisposition to anxiety. They tend to be kids who worry a lot, and they're more vulnerable to stress. Situational anxiety would be you and I could be stressed by doing this webcast.
Okay.
But I think we're doing pretty good. So I'm not feeling too stressed. Okay, so this next slide is the generalized anxiety disorder, is the most common anxiety disorder. And here's some of the typical worries of kids who have general anxiety disorder. They worry about their grades. They worry about performance in sports. They worry about, am I going to be on time? Am I going to be late? They worry about family issues. They worry storms, their health, all those kinds of things. They're just like worrying. These kids, they just have a really tough time. If you want to find kids who have anxiety disorders, one of the really quick screening things to do is first day of school at the middle school, you look at the sixth graders who are feeling lots of anxiety about they can't open their lockers, they got to get to class on time. And so the kid with a true anxiety disorder really, really suffers in those first days of being a sixth grader, because
new school and all that.
And actually, most sixth graders are very anxious, but those kids with anxiety disorder, boy, it's just such a difficult time for them. How can we help them? Be in the hallways. Everyone should be in the hallways, I think. Every staff person to help those sixth graders when they come into school. Because it's such an anxiety-provoking situation for them, and that's one way that we can intervene. Some of the physical symptoms of general anxiety disorder: this restlessness, fatigue, inability to sleep, difficulty concentrating. Again, irritability comes up, and feeling tense, muscle tension. Okay. I want to talk briefly about social anxiety disorder, and I've listed these on your, and by the way, there's no test for you, so you don't have to memorize these, okay? But I just wanted to list these for you, and there's a lot more information that's available if you do become more interested in anxiety disorders. But these are kids who are hesitant, passive. They don't want to be in the spotlight. They don't want to have to come up in front of the classroom.
They wouldn't do what we're doing today.
They probably would not.
Okay.
No. We're maybe safe to say we don't have an anxiety disorder.
Okay.
We have other ones, but we're not going to talk about those right now. But they avoid eye contact. They speak softly. They're that child in your room that it's back in that corner, and they're just hoping that no one's going to call on them, and that they don't have to interact with anyone. And it's actually one good way to find kids with social anxiety disorder is you look for your kids who aren't interacting and who are seem to be kind of loners, because it's just a stressful situation for them to have to interact with people. Okay, other anxiety disorders, we have the obsessive compulsive disorder, and it's a pattern of repetitive thoughts and behaviors. And I actually wanted to talk a little bit about some of the typical obsessive thoughts. And some of the typical ones are kids having a fear of harm to a loved one, so they worry about while they're at school, is something going to happen to my mom or my dad. Or they have rituals about that, so they have to count to 10, for example. While they're thinking about that, they count to 10, and by counting to 10 every time, they feel relieved. But they have some kind of ritual that's associated with it. Perfectionism actually can be a part of OCD, so that a kid with true OCD, when they make a mistake, for example, on their paper, oftentimes instead of like erasing, they'll start over, and they'll start rewriting the entire thing. It may take them an excessive amount of time to finish one assignment, because when they make a mistake, they can't just erase. They have to do it perfectly because of this anxiety that gets kicked off if they would actually erase their mistake. Kids' need for order oftentimes is one of the typical obsessive thoughts. They're constantly thinking of, they want their world in order. So some of the behaviors, compulsions, can be things like washing hands over and over and over because of wanting to get those germs off their hands. Arranging objects in a certain way. I worked with one student who could not start his homework until everything was arranged perfectly on his desk at home, and he had a specific place for every object in his desk. It took him a good 45 minutes to get things just lined up exactly before he could start his homework. And then if his little brother or sister came in and messed something up, he had to go back and rearrange everything to get it in the perfect order. Counting or touching rituals are also typical. And hoarding or saving things that are worthless are sometimes a sign of obsessive-compulsive disorder. Not being able to throw things away because of feeling like if I throw that away, something bad's going to happen.
I think that the television show Monk portrays a character with obsessive-compulsive disorder,
Yes,
doesn't it?
It does.
Okay.
It does. And unfortunately, I haven't seen that program, but I've heard that it's an excellent example of someone with obsessive-compulsive disorder.
Yeah, and my understanding it's been well received as portraying that character in an accurate way,
Right, right.
rather than stereotyping mental illness.
Right. So despite what we said about television before, you may want to tune into that show to take a look at that. So our next thing that we're going to be talking about here, in our next disorder, let me talk about treatment first, actually. Again, we find that cognitive behavioral therapy is really effective with kids with anxiety disorder. We teach them how to use positive self-talk, how to begin to say positive things to themselves about themselves, how to catch and refute irrational thoughts. I've talked about that before. With anxiety disorder, progressive muscle relaxation training has been very, very effective. In other words, we're teaching children how to counteract stress by simply relaxing. And progressive muscle relaxation is a series of, tensing all the different muscle parts. So let's say we tense our fist, and then we relax our fist. And we tense our arm, and we relax our arm. We tense our shoulders, we relax our shoulders. We go through all the different muscles in our body, and then teach the child how to do this relaxation. Systematic desensitization is a way of combining the muscle relaxation with them having thoughts and seeing themselves in a situation that provokes anxiety for them. So if they get anxious in the classroom, what we would do in regard to treatment is we would teach them the relaxation skills. Then we would actually have them visualize and see themselves in their classroom while maintaining this relaxation. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute when we talk about phobias. And of course, medication, again, has been shown to be pretty effective in helping kids with anxiety. Although I'd have to say, my experience has been, if you have a child who's pretty motivated and works really hard at using the relaxation, the positive self-talk, I would say 80% of those kids recover without any use of medication, which in my mind is a preferable way to go. This disorder is sometimes clumped in with anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And it results when kids are exposed to some kind of traumatic event in their life, and where they have a fear for survival, or where they witness something that is so extremely anxiety provoking that it causes this sense of overwhelming fear and overwhelming sense of dread. And to be diagnosed with PTSD, these behaviors of re-experiencing, avoiding, and being hyper-aroused have to happen over a month period of time, and causing some kind of impairment in function, meaning interfering within the family dynamics, interfering at school. These are kids that might look like if they're hyper-aroused, they might look like they have ADHD, for example. And hyper-arousal means that they're constantly on guard, they're constantly looking, because they don't know what's going to be happening, and they want to make sure that they're ready. And so this is one of the reasons why we really need good diagnoses in regard to ADHD. And when you suspect in the classroom, boy, this child sure looks like he has ADHD, is that you make that referral to the pupil personnel team, and they do a real thorough job of taking a look at, well, let's make sure we don't have a trauma disorder going on. And so someone on that team is going to be skilled in doing a trauma history. And those of you who are really interested in some training in trauma, one of the best places I have found is a place called the National Institute of Trauma and Loss in Children. Their website just has wonderful, wonderful intervention strategies. And I think it's tlcinstitute.org. They're a nonprofit, but they provide kind of training that someone on your pupil personnel team might be very interested in, or perhaps has been trained, or you yourself as a classroom teacher, I think would really benefit from this kind of training. So anyways, PTSD can mask itself and look like ADHD, or can look like that kid he's oppositional. You know, he's always angry. He's always, and so we really need to look at what is the history.
Earlier you mentioned the high percentage of children that have been molested.
Yes.
Now, is that something that could precipitate PTSD?
Absolutely. That's a really good point. So what we know is that with trauma, the memory gets frozen in our bodies. And so if a child was molested, say at age 4, we can see the results of that trauma all the way through until the child gets some treatment. So you might have a 9th grade girl who's really struggling with a lot of different issues, and what might be the origin of that struggling is the trauma that occurred to her when she was 4 years old.
Okay.
Yeah. This actually is a drawing from one of the, I believe, let's see, she was 8 when I worked with her, and she referred to me because of difficulties in school with some acting out behaviors. And one of the things we do in trauma treatment is we have kids draw, because drawing is an experiential, it helps unfreeze these memories. It gets them out of their body. Drawing and journaling, these kinds of things are very effective. Play therapy, actually, drama, these kinds of experiential interventions are extremely beneficial for kids who have trauma. This is a drawing of this young girl that I worked with, and she's describing in her drawing here a memory, and you can see her at the bottom of the picture there where it's labeled me. She labels herself at the very bottom. Although I see now that she's labeled me up there, but that's actually her mom, and Dad is on the left. And the picture depicts Dad choking Mom, and which was a very traumatic event for this child, because the child was witnessing a number of different times domestic violence. This is a follow-up drawing. This is a picture of me when I saw Daddy be mean to my mommy. Again, she recalls this. She was 3 or 4 years old. Actually, as she describes it, she was 3 years old. She says, this is me crawling. I was crying. When people fight or yell at me, I start crying. I get really sensitive really quick. An example then of trauma is when she's around people who are yelling, she goes into a trauma response because it reminds her of when she was young and witnessed this traumatic event. And that's what we call re-experience a symptom. So if she hears, a teacher raise their voice, it send her into a trauma response. And so kids become very sensitized to sights and sounds that were around them during the time of trauma. I mentioned that drawing is very helpful. This is not the same girl. This is another girl who had witnessed some traumatic events in her life in regard to her parents fighting, actually, also. And this is a 10-year-old girl that was in treatment with me a few years back. And when I asked her to show me what her hurt looks like, this is what she drew. And she says, I felt like they were breaking me apart. Now, obviously, when you have kids with these kinds of thoughts and these kinds of feelings, it's very difficult for them to come into school and be putting their mind to what they need to be doing, which, again, emphasizes to us why we have to try to intervene in these kids' lives. This is one last string from this same girl. This is where I felt the hurt the most when it happened, and what had happened was my parents fighting. And so she feels it in her stomach and would actually get physically sick as she experiences her trauma or her memories of her trauma. Okay, so here's the problem. Take a look at all these symptoms. Now, how do we know, is the depression a result of a physical predisposition? There was some stress that kicked them into depression. Is the depression a result of having been traumatized? What's going on? But all these behaviors are typical of kids who've been traumatized. So as you look at these behaviors, you can see pretty much everything that we've talked about this morning, right here, which points out the importance of doing a really good trauma history so that we can find out the origin. Where did it come from? And we're not treating something without knowing what's the precipitating factor in causing the problem. Okay. I want to talk briefly about externalizing behaviors. And again, as we talked about earlier, Nick, teachers are probably more aware of these in the classroom.
These are the students that stand out.
That's right. I did come up, interestingly, I came up with a really good group way to identify kids with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, with a real hyperactivity. It happened a few years back when there was going to be an assembly in the gymnasium at our middle school in Watertown, and the speaker was late. And so instead of having all the kids, sit there forever and ever, the kids were kind of milling around, and then some of them were playing basketball, and eventually everyone was worn out, and they were all sitting in the bleachers except for the kids who really did have ADHD.
Okay.
They were still going. They had so much energy. But ADHD typically are kids with an attention deficit. They have trouble focusing. They're constantly, they hear the hum of that camera over there. They hear something in the hallway. They see someone fidgeting with something. They notice this paper clip here. And all the while, the teacher is trying to talk, but they just cannot focus. Their attention gets just taken away. They pay attention. Actually, attention deficit is a misnomer, because it's not that they can't pay attention. They pay attention really well, but they pay attention to like everything other than things that are happening out in front of them.
Kind of like someone keeps changing the TV channel for them,
Yeah.
and their focus
Right.
gets switched from one place to another.
And sometimes parents are confused by that, because when a teacher might say, "Well, boy, I wonder, has your child ever been checked out for possible attention deficit disorder?" So, oh no, my kid can really pay attention. Well, you should see him play video games. Well, he can sit there for 3 hours, or he can watch this TV, or he can or he can do his karate and he's like right on. And it's what happens with ADHD is it's kids can pay attention to things they're interested in, and it grabs their attention. But it's things that are boring, that are like the seat work kinds of things, or if we're presenting something that's not like really exciting, they have a really extreme difficult time tuning in. So it's not that they can't pay attention; they can't pay attention to things that like don't stimulate them. And of course, we know there are kids who don't have the hyperactiveness; they just have the attention problems, and so they may not be that all that extraneous movement. Interestingly, when I talked about things that stimulate them seem to help them focus and pay attention, physicians and psychiatrists and all kinds of research has been done and found that many kids do respond very positively to a stimulant medication that actually stimulates their central nervous system, stimulates them to where they should be. It's kind of like their central nervous system has gone to sleep, and when kids get overtired, they look kind of hyper, actually, many kids.
Yep, they can.
It's when your central nervous system gets like really slowed down where these attention problems seem to crop up. And so interestingly, stimulant medication actually helps kids get focused, many kids, and it certainly isn't the answer for every child. We do a lot of we do a lot of behavior modification kinds of interventions with kids with ADHD to try to help them in the classroom, to have point systems, reward systems, are quite effective actually for many of these kids. Oppositional defiant disorder, again, these are kids that we know in the classroom are kids that like to say no. And their parents know that as well. They're saying no at home, they're saying no at school, they're saying no everywhere. They can be a challenge, obviously. And it can be a challenge to like these kids. And that's our challenge as educators, is we have to be able to show that we understand that their behavior isn't a reflection of us. We can't personalize kids' behavior, because when we start personalizing it, and we think somehow we get hooked in then to their stuff, and then we overreact, and we feed right into some of these symptoms.
Right, and then you get in a real negative feedback loop then.
Right. I think the same thing is with this conduct disorder. Generally, you see more with kids who are in later adolescence who've developed such a pattern of behavioral issues that they have a full-blown conduct disorder, and then we're more into kids with some delinquency kinds of issues and maybe gang activity, etc. But when you think about that, I mean, think about what do gangs offer kids? They offer them a sense of belonging somewhere. They offer them acceptance. You're okay. We like you. They offer them a chance to feel like they're worthwhile. And unfortunately, more and more kids drift that way who aren't having success anywhere else. They're not having success in the classroom. They're not having success at home. They're not getting recognized. They feel lonely. And these are the kind of kids that tend to drift toward gang activity. So I put this at the bottom there. Acting out behavior often results from anger, discouragement, and a loss of power. So we have to look at how can we help kids feel more encouraged. How can we help them gain a sense of power? So before we get to some of the recommendations, we're going to talk just real briefly a few of the other disorders that you may have heard of or have had kids who have these disorders, and that would be the eating disorders, the obesity, overeating, anorexia, not eating, obviously, and bulimia, which would be the binge eating and then purging themselves after binging. Interestingly, the eating disorder is actually an addictive disorder, and there's a real addictive quality to it, and really does need intervention and treatment from professionals who are trained in working with kids with eating disorders. They're life-threatening and are extremely, extremely difficult to treat in many situations. So it's important to make those referrals when you suspect that a child may have an eating disorder. Self-mutilation, we're seeing in the schools quite a bit, especially in middle, high school kids who are cutting on themselves. And interesting, again, there's a addictive quality to this, and kids who do cut report this feeling of relief, of kind of like this sense of well-being after they cut. So it generally leads to a kid with lots of high anxiety issues that, again, may be associated with trauma, may be associated with a depressive episode, may be associated with an anxiety disorder, but when they cut, they feel relief, and they feel connected to the world. Many people fear a child who cuts is suicidal, and actually just the opposite is true. They're less likely to be suicidal because they're finding relief. It connects them back.
They're using cutting as a way of coping as opposed
Correct.
to considering suicide.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, that doesn't mean that that you don't have to worry.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, we don't have to worry. She's a cutter. But it is true that they tend to use this as a way to cope with the situation. Substance abuse is a disorder that we're very concerned about, and I know DPI has done a lot of work in regard to providing programs in the schools to help schools deal with kids with substance abuse issues. So substance abuse is one that we are concerned about. The number of kids are looking at getting earlier and earlier in their first onset of use. I think back now when we started just a while back when I talked about David who died by suicide, that I think was that the drawing I showed you of him. David, actually, his underlying issue was depression and substance addiction. He had been to treatment 3 different times for his alcohol addiction, starting his first time in 7th grade, actually. And that was, I think, part of his discouragement is that he just didn't get better, and saw no hope. When kids lose hope, that's where we're really, really worried and concerned about them.
Yeah. And when you have those comorbid disorders, meaning they're both occurring at the same time, one can make the other one worse, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Because I know, alcohol, for instance, can reduce our inhibitions, which then can lead maybe the person more likely to attempt suicide or something like that.
Absolutely. In fact, I think the statistics on that, if I'm not mistaken, I think alcohol or substances are involved in about 50% of completed suicides.
Okay.
Which points out exactly what you're saying. So these eating disorder, self-mutilation, substance abuse, actually those top 3 can really be termed and looked at as addictive disorders in some way, shape, or form, especially obviously substance abuse. Tourette's syndrome is a tic disorder that seems to be brought on by stress. So we have a child who has that physical disposition to a tic disorder like Tourette's, then it's can be can be initiated by stress. Now the tics can be vocal tics, so you have some kids who are like spouting out things, or they can be physical tics, oftentimes facial tics with Tourette's syndrome. Developmental disorders, you have probably, again, been aware of kids in your school who have autism, a disorder that interferes with their ability to have relationships with others, oftentimes interferes with any kind of communication. There's some exciting kinds of things being done in the world of treating autism, but it's a really difficult disorder. And oftentimes these kids are in our special education programs receiving help. Asperger's is kind of what we call, I guess, high-functioning autism in a sense of kids who do have language and can interact with you, but they do have a lot of social issues and social difficulties. They tend to have a real problem in being able to read facial expression and body language. They don't understand innuendo. When you tell jokes, etc. Kids with Asperger's oftentimes take it very seriously, so they miss those subtle types of communication that are important to be able to get along well with others. And then kind of a catch-all is PDD, which is pervasive developmental disorder. That, you know, it's kind of like that autism spectrum kind of a thing where a kid falls, and so these developmental disorders are kind of a catch-all for kids who may not meet specifically an autism or Asperger's diagnosis. And the last one I put in was schizophrenia, and we're not going to really talk much about that because it's very unlikely that you're going to have, in your career of teaching, that you're going to come across more than one or two kids who have childhood schizophrenia. But they're there, and kids do have schizophrenia. It is treatable. That's the other good thing about it. There are medications. The primary intervention with schizophrenia actually is medication intervention, which can be very effective. All right, well, I've covered most of the disorders, and the purpose really this morning is to just let you know what, there's a lot of disorders out there, and kids have these, and we need to be just aware of them. And some things we find that we can do as a school, and this is an interesting research. I think this is a slide John Humphreys, I borrowed from him, and John Humphreys being the school psychologist consultant here at DPI. School connectedness is the extent to which students feel accepted, valued, respected, and included in schools. And this connectedness has been found to correlate. Now, it's a negative correlation, meaning the more connected a kid is, the less likely they are to have mental health issues and mental health symptoms, especially, in particular, depression. The more connected kids are, the less likely they are to be depressed. And how can we help them? I'm really impressed. Kathy Jensen is actually a school psychologist I know in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. She related to me one of the things they do in Fond du Lac at the high school is after the new ninth graders have been in school for a while, they have the entire faculty, they put the pictures of every ninth grader up in the gymnasium, all around the gymnasium. They have the entire faculty walk through, and they put a check mark on the picture of kids they feel that they have some kind of connection with. Yeah, that they're connected to. And then they look and see which pictures don't have any check marks.
Yep.
And then they make a point of finding teachers who are willing to make a connection with those kids. That's a powerful intervention. That's way more than I can do as a psychologist sitting in my office, because I may never see that child who doesn't feel connected to anyone at this big high school. But this child gets connected to a teacher, an adult who shows some concern and interest, and lo and behold, I never get to see that child because they get better when they feel connected. So that's just a really important thing to be thinking about, of how in our schools can we make sure that all kids have some kind of connection with an adult. It sounds overwhelming when you think about it, but when I heard Kathy talk about that intervention, I thought, well, wow, that makes a lot of sense.
It's a great idea.
Yeah, and that's doable in every one of our schools in the state of Wisconsin, for them to do the same thing and to make sure that every child has a connection with some adult in their school. So, some other things that you can do when we talk about intervention is know what your resources are. Your pupil personnel team is there to help you. That's why they're in this job, and that's why they want you to come and say, hey, I'm really concerned about so-and-so. So know your resources within your building, obviously. Get a good relationship going with your pupil personnel team. Know your community, really, because you may know some therapists in town, etc., that you might be able to refer kids directly to. Realize that human services agencies are available, especially for families who don't have any insurance and may need some type of intervention. Voice your concern, ask for help. kids aren't going to get help unless you, voice the concern. So you may suspect, you have a gut feeling, you're worried about the kid that just sits there and doesn't say anything. You need to let people know. And then this follow-up means, you need to let them know more than once, because if no one's intervened for that child, you need to follow up, make sure that someone has intervened, that someone is talking to them. And maybe this starts out by a phone call home, just to get a sense of what's going on at home, or just to express concern. Or maybe it starts with, obviously, talking to this child and saying, Billy, I'm kind of concerned because you haven't said much of anything in the last couple of weeks, and just wondering how things are going for you. Just to begin to get those gut feelings about kids, I think.
Share concern.
Yeah, absolutely. So, more specifically, all of you know these things, but I think it's always nice to touch base again on some of these basic kinds of things. Pay attention to the positive behaviors. So many, I feel so bad for a lot of these kids with ADHD, because they've spent their entire life with people telling them to stop something. Stop doing that. Stop moving this. Pay attention. And one of the things we know how we can change kids' behavior is by paying attention to their positive behaviors. Okay. You catch them when they are actually paying attention, and you reinforce that. You use a behavior modification program, a point system, etc., and you help begin to point out the positive behaviors. Learning about students' personal lives, I think, is really helpful. Get to know kids. I had such a wonderful privilege when I first started teaching. It was back again in the early 70s when the flex mod system was really big, and which allowed us in the classroom to have segments of time where we could do things like interview students. And I recall interviewing every one of my students, and I think I had 150 students. I did like 10-minute interviews with them. And again, I could do this because I had this flex mod system was just I thought, a really cool way to be able to teach. But it was one of the reasons that led me to become a school psychologist, actually. Because I'll tell you what, you spend 10 minutes talking to all the kids that you work with, it's pretty incredible what they tell you. Just in those 10 minutes, what they tell you about what's going on in their lives. And you realize, oh my gosh, well now it makes sense why they're not doing well in school. It really opens up your eyes, and it led me actually to pursue my degree in school psychology because I wanted to have the time to be able to help kids and not have just 10 minutes to talk to them. Helping children feel useful and helpful, we've kind of covered that already. That's so important that they have a sense of that they're useful. And we know many of you classroom teachers will use techniques like, Johnny or Sally who are having difficulty in your classroom, and you'll do things with them and set something up where they can begin to feel helpful to you. They could be your helper and run some errands for you, those kinds of things. Foster communication with parents. I think that's really important that parents know that, hey, we know it's tough, and most parents I've worked with, they may have their own struggles, but they want their children to do well. And so fostering that communication, I think, is really important for our schools in general, that the parents feel like, hey, we have an ally. The school is going to help us out. Using varied instructional methods, obviously, we know about that. And unfortunately, we know that, Nick and I know that you're going to remember 10% of what we're saying here, because we're doing this lecture mode thing, and we know that by research, you remember about 10%, okay? If we had you doing some experiential things, and it's pretty hard to do with being the system we have here, but if we had you do some experiential things, you'd remember 80% of what you were doing. And so within that classroom, I just encourage you to do as many experiential activities as you can, because that's how kids remember, and that's really important. Pay attention to students' writings and drawings. I'm just going to give you a couple of quick examples of why it's important to pay attention to what they're writing, what they're drawing. This is a fourth or fifth grade teacher a number of years ago who brought this to me. And she had an activity. This was an activity when the kids came back from summer vacation. she said, all of you take out a paper, and here's crayons, and I want you to draw a picture of yourself. Okay? And so then they draw a picture of themselves, and this is this little girl who drew a picture of herself. Then she says, now turn the paper over, and I want you to draw a picture of a person of the opposite sex. So she draws this little girl, herself, and then she draws a picture of the opposite sex. Now, the teacher realized, wow, I wonder what this is about. So we have a picture of the opposite sex, no face at all. But what really concerned her was that this little girl started erasing, and you can see in the groin area, started erasing, and actually erased right through the paper. And so she was, brought this girl to my attention, and obviously we did an intervention and did, well, it wasn't an intervention, I guess we did an interview, and found out this is a little girl who's being sexually abused. And kids will tell you, it's just that they need to be asked, and so seldom do they get a chance to actually tell someone. Because here's a little girl that was doing extremely well in school. She was overperforming, was getting straight A's, was involved in a lot of different school activities, even at 10 years old. And so we might never have picked this up other than this teacher bringing this drawing to us. So that's just an example of where drawings can be pretty powerful. This is another example, and it doesn't take a psychologist to figure out when you look at this picture and you look at this picture. Again, lots of erasing in the groin area. And again, this was actually a child where there was incest in the family, and we were able to provide some intervention. Because why? Because a teacher brought this to our attention. Here's an example of, this was an assignment this is a 7th grade student, and the assignment was to write a poem about something that makes you feel afraid. Write a poem about something that makes you feel afraid. And so I'd like to read this to you. It's a little difficult to read. The poem is entitled Every Night. Every night I sit and weep. I hear them yell, I do not peep. First they argue, then they scream. Boom! Then Dad slams the screen. I race to my window to see him walk to his car. I dare not talk. Adam and I go downstairs. Mom looked as if she was fighting millions of bears. We quietly race back up to our room. Then he comes home, you can tell. Boom! Then Mom leaves. He comes upstairs, and we fearful gasp. Adam is screaming, oh, here he comes. Pretty powerful poem.
Very.
Again, an assignment, write a poem about something that makes you feel afraid. And it's just another technique that you can use to be able to do kind of a screening of helping and picking up kids that may be in need. And this is something, obviously, the teacher brought to my attention. And again, we were able to provide some intervention.
A couple of times you mentioned, doing interventions with these kids. Part of that involves making a report to County Child Protective Services, correct?
Correct. Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah. When we suspect any kind of sexual abuse or physical abuse or emotional abuse, we're mandated reporters. All of you, every teacher in the building, every pupil personnel person, administrators, we are all mandated reporters. We don't have a choice, so we must report if we suspect sexual abuse or physical abuse. And I guess that's what I meant by intervention, actually, was to be able to make that report to social services, human services. And you don't have to have like all the evidence. It can be a gut feeling even. The reality is you are protected. You will not be sued. You cannot be sued. There's a law that gives you protection if you make a referral in good faith. And so you don't have to worry about that piece. And again, sometimes teachers are a little bit hesitant about it because, I know that pupil personnel staff are very helpful and willing, to make that report. if a teacher themselves, well, I just don't want to do that, the pupil personnel staff will help them with that. So we're coming near the end here. We're talking about how can we create this reclaiming, caring environment? How can we attach the kids? One thing is that we have to know and realize that relationship is an action, it's not a feeling. And so we have to show kids that we care about them. We can't just say, you know, I really care about you. We have to show that somehow, that we care about them. You're not going to be able to show every child in your classroom that you care about them. Or I'm hoping that you'll do, and I'm hoping that this will be an impetus for you. I hope that this stimulates you a little bit to say, you know what, this year I'm going to find out 1 or 2 kids in my building that need some kind of connection, that need a relationship. And then I'm going to do that. I'm going to connect with them. So part of that might be this saying, love the unlovable. And that's, when you love the unlovable, you're able to show them that you care. And you don't get hooked by their stuff. You don't personalize it, you know, when they're having a temper outburst. And you disengage from conflict, in fact, as opposed to engaging in conflict. And by doing these things, you can earn kids' trust. And once you have their trust, it's remarkable the kinds of changes kids can make. So you with whatever child you're going to work with now, you're going to choose 1 or 2 kids. This is your assignment. Okay, this is your assignment. You choose 1 or 2 kids. Just think about it. I don't know how many people are going to watch this webcast, but let's just say 100 people in the state here, 100 teachers end up watching this, and each of those 100 choose to help 2 kids. You know, we have 200 kids who otherwise may not have gotten help, who are going to get better because they get a connection with these teachers. Maybe 1,000. Maybe we'll get 1,000 people to watch this. Then we've got 2,000 kids that we're going to help. So, you know, it's just so important to do this and to make this commitment, and that is your assignment. So we're going to follow up on that. Stay in for the long haul. Use outreach counseling. Outreach counseling means things like you go in and cafeteria, you sit next to this child maybe that you're mentoring, and you visit for a little bit. And then you leave. You're not spending a long time. You're spending a couple minutes finding out what they're having for lunch, visit with them a little bit. Checking in. You might do that, you walk through their, now I love doing this, and those of you who are pupil personnel staff can relate to this because you have some time and flexibility to do this, of just popping into kids' classes like their art class. They love you. They not love you, but they love when you come in and you recognize what they're doing. You ask them what they're doing. You pop into their art class, you pop into their woodworking class, and you spend a couple minutes and you find out what's going on. And it's not like you're signaling them out. You know, you check in with a number of different kids in those classes. So that's outreach counseling. You go to them. Showing them respect, sharing some joy, having fun, having a sense of humor, and bringing that into your classroom is really important. Inviting children to belong, and there again we go with how important it is for kids to feel like they belong. And it's just a very healing kind of thing for them. So we want to involve them in as many activities as possible. You know, a lot of the high-risk kids, again, I'm impressed by a program that a good friend of mine, Ann Rumpf, is a school psychologist at the high school, and Tammy Forster, a social worker, who organize kids who are at high risk, and they go out and they, in the fall, every fall, and they go out and they rake people's yards. You know, people who have physical handicaps or who aren't able to do those things. And so they do for the community. They give back to the community. What it does is it helps them become involved in an activity. Okay. And we've found with delinquents especially, kids with delinquency issues, when they can be help out and give back, that it has a tremendous impact and helps them actually do better. Be consistent and caring is the last one I have listed here. I wanted to talk just real briefly here near the end about confidentiality, because you will get a relationship, and you do have a relationship with students already. And sometimes students will say to you, well, you know, can you promise me you won't tell anyone about this? And you certainly can promise them that you'll keep things confidential unless it has something to do with a mandated, unless this child's in danger of some type, physical, sexual, emotional, and or they're also sharing that they may harm someone or that they may harm themselves. So obviously we can't keep that confidential. And you can say to kids up front, yes, I'm happy to keep things confidential. However, if you tell me something where I suspect that you may be being hurt, or someone might hurt you, or you might hurt yourself, I need to report that.
Kind of a disclaimer when we're working with students.
Now, you don't have to do a disclaimer. We as therapists do that when we're working in therapy. We do that disclaimer. If you're a teacher, you don't have to do the disclaimer, but you have to make the report.
Right.
So you can say to the kids, yes, I'm going to keep things confidential. But when they say, well, my dad's been hitting me, well, then you can't keep that confidential. You do need to report that. Okay, so safety precedes privacy. Okay, I don't know. We've talked a lot. We should have probably been keeping track of our time, but I'm thinking we're like right on our time thing.
I'm sure we are.
We've done this so often that we're just like, we'll know exactly we're on our correct. We're not going to tell you what the correct timeline was, but we'll let you know that we've done it correctly. Finally, self-care. We can't do all this hard work as educators unless we're taking care of ourselves. So, number one, I think on our list is we have to say, learn to say no. You can't help every child, is what I'm saying. You have to choose some kids to help, but you can't help them all, and you can't help everyone in your community, and you can't help everyone at church, and you can't help everyone in your family. You have to figure out, what are my limits? It's interesting, those of us in this profession, the education profession, the nursing profession, the counseling profession, we actually tend to have problems saying no.
Yeah.
So, Nick, when you first called me about this, maybe I should have said, no, I think maybe I should be golfing that day, but here I am, and I'm glad I'm here, actually. But we do need to find a balance of how do we say no. Because in the helping professions, many of us tend to come from families that didn't work so well, actually. And within our family, we are actually the ones that were pretty good at helping out, pretty good at problem solving. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes those experiences in our families of origin lead us into these professions of the helping profession. Addressing your own emotional issues, I guess that cuts right to that. Figuring out, well, what is my family of origin? How did it impact me? Roger, as you were talking about these depression symptoms, I have like 3 or 4 of those, It only takes 5 of those to have the diagnosis of depression. And so you may need to look at, do I have depression? Do I have an anxiety disorder? How can I get help? And then to seek help. Usually that happens to us when we're in our 40s somewhere. We finally figure it out. Oh, maybe I should be seeing someone to get some help.
But as you said, these are very treatable, though. So
absolutely.
People shouldn't be afraid or concerned about, talking with, maybe starting with their primary physician and seeing if they should be talking to a specialist.
Right. But I still remember an adult client I had many years ago, because I did part-time private practice while I was doing my school psychology practice, and he had been depressed for 11 years, and he came in, and we did some talk therapy, but he actually was a person who responded extremely well to one of these SSRIs I was talking about, and within 3 weeks, he was feeling like no depressive symptoms. And he was just saying, boy, I wish I had done this 11 years ago. And he was trying to pull himself up by his bootstraps, because people said, well, you can do it. You can get better. But, you can't get better without good treatment. And that's what I'd encourage all of you to do if you are worried about yourself. Own a pet, listen to music, and play. Those are 3 protective factors. They've done some interesting research on that. People who have pets are less likely to be depressed.
Lower blood pressure, they say, too.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's going to be a run on probably dogs and cat stores now. People are going to go out and buy pets. But spend time with your pet. Spend time with people. Relationships are really important. Stay connected to the earth. We know that the earth is healing. So those of you who garden, you're connected to the earth already. But just spend time outside. Spend time in nature, because that is another protective factor. Exercise, we know that protects us and that helps treat us actually if we're suffering from anxiety or depression. A good amount of sleep, eating well is very important. Connect with your own spirituality, whatever that might be. We know again that that's a protective factor and that it's just a very important part of our lives. And then pat yourself on the back, for watching this webcast, spending whatever time we did spend, the exact amount of time, the right amount of time, but congratulate yourself, you spent some time here and you're working towards being the best you can be. And so you do need to congratulate yourself for making the best efforts that you can. And make realistic efforts. So we're not asking you to help everyone out there. We're asking you to help a couple kids who are at high risk and make a commitment to help those kids. So I've really enjoyed being with you, whoever you are, wherever you are. I'm happy to take your emails. I think at the beginning I had my email address, but it's Roger J as in John Klein at charter.net. And I'm happy to answer any other questions that may have come up as a result of this morning's presentation. So please be in touch.
Yeah, and if you can advance the next slide.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Another resource we have for more information. John Humphreys is our consultant here at the Department of Public Instruction in the area of school psychology. And on the slide there you'll see his phone number and his email address as well. Roger, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to do the webcast today, and I want to thank everyone in the audience for watching.
All right, thanks.